Let's talk about Apostolic Origins. Now, as we've established both in writing and spoken a little bit before in these videos, at the time of Christ, the Jews living under Roman control were in preparation or anticipation of a new covenant. They were waiting for the redemption of Israel once more. And if we understand the creation or the formation of the New Testament canon along the backdrop of covenant history, an entirely new framework from which we understand the canon must be developed. So we understand that the structural framework of a canon was already in place at the time of Christ, and that was the covenant of the Old Testament, which led to the Old Testament canon. As a new covenant was being anticipated, the next step for this covenant would be covenantal agents, those who could transmit the covenant. And this would be especially important if that covenant was meant to go to all the nations, as we read in Luke 24. These covenantal agents were the apostles. The apostles served as those who would proclaim the redemptive plan of Christ in this new covenant to all the world. They become the critical link between what God is doing in his overall plan and how that plan is communicated from the Word of God. Just as in the Old Covenant, it began with the oral communication of God to man and was quickly followed by that communication into written tradition, so too the ministers of the New Covenant, seeing themselves as such, these apostolic agents, would receive that oral tradition and follow it with written communication, making them, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3:6, ministers of the New Covenant. Now, as I said earlier, this covenant communication through the apostolic agents began with oral transmission. Christ communicated this covenant during the 3 years of his ministry to the apostles, who would then communicate it to the rest of the world. And it is a well-known and established fact that this began in the process of oral transmission. An oral apostolic tradition was developed based around the teachings of the apostles and what Jesus had taught them. Now, the idea of tradition in Protestant circles has a very negative connotation. Of course, we react rather violently against these ideas because of the Roman Catholic understanding of tradition. But it cannot be denied that there was an oral tradition that began what would become the New Testament canon. Paul in 2 Thessalonians speaks to the church of the tradition that they received from them. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks of that which he has received and has passed on, another possible reference to oral tradition. In many cases, you find this reference to tradition on the mouth of Paul. We cannot deny there was oral tradition. However, we have to understand what we mean by oral tradition. And the oral tradition of the apostles always pointed specifically to certain contexts. In 1 Corinthians 15, the oral tradition that Paul is communicating, he relays in the very next verses as the resurrection account of Jesus Christ. Earlier in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul speaks of a tradition and then follows it by referring to the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. So these traditions weren't ambiguous, they weren't unknown. They were specific doctrinal teachings of the apostles. And we have to realize that when we speak of tradition, we don't want to fall back into what's called anachronism, the idea that things as they are now are as they always have been, in the sense that a word like tradition, as it may be seen now in organizations like the Roman Catholic Church, is always the way it has been, and then we end up reading that definition back into the documents that precede it. This is a mistake. The tradition of the apostles has been written very clearly for us, that it was the foundational teachings of the resurrection, the Lord's Supper, and the like. And so we are talking about apostolic tradition, not ecclesiastical tradition, not even human tradition, but tradition associated with a particular office, the office of the apostles, that was not a permanent office. It was an office that would die out. So the question we must ask is, how do you maintain a theological system? How do you communicate a covenant to all the nations if it will eventually die out in oral transmission? Well, the answer is rather obvious. You write the oral transmission down. And that is exactly what the apostles did. They wrote down the oral tradition, so that when that day would come and there were no more apostles and that oral tradition was lost, the written tradition would continue on. And this, of course, is not unheard of in history. The historian Herodotus wrote down his histories so that they would be available to all the world for all time. The historian Thucydides did the same thing, not saying that he didn't want them to be only available from the voice of men, but that they would be heard for all time through all nations. It was a common practice that if you were to communicate any kind of historical covenant, any kind of historical document, it would go from oral to written, so that it would last and outlast the life of the historian, or outlast the life of the apostle. And again, going back to the understanding that the apostles saw themselves as ministers of a new covenant, it would be a natural process, a natural thought work to go from the oral tradition to one of a written tradition, as was the practice of covenant at that time. The idea of apostolicity, what brings us back to this segment on apostolic origins, is that the author need not necessarily be an apostle, but that the author would have written in the time of the apostles, or even that the author would have information directly gained from an apostle. And this was recognized even by the earliest church. This is how Tertullian could write of Luke and Mark as apostolic men, even though neither Luke nor Mark were apostles. But Luke speaks of having gotten his information, or received his information, from the eyewitnesses. Mark, attested to by Papias, which we read about in Eusebius, was the scribe of Peter. His gospel is the recordings of Peter. And we see hints of that throughout the Gospel of Mark, not the least of which is the fact that Peter is the first apostle mentioned in Mark and the last apostle mentioned in Mark. He forms a bookend, or an inclusio, in that Gospel. The author of Hebrews, in the same way, while unknown, speaks of communicating a message that he has received from those who were eyewitnesses, a direct reference to the apostles. So when we speak of the strength of apostolic origins and apostolic authority, we are not suggesting that the New Testament canon was written specifically or solely by apostles, but that it was written in the time of the apostles, within their lifetime, and it was communicated by those who knew the apostles, those who were able to get their information from the apostles. And this is the reason that other books would be rejected. The Shepherd of Hermas, again, from the Muratorian fragment, is rejected on the basis that it was written a century later than the apostles. Therefore, it could not be considered part of the canon. The Gospel of Peter, as we talked about with Bishop Serapion, was rejected because it was not written by Peter. The Gospel of Thomas would be in the same category. The early work called the Acts of Paul and Thecla was eventually removed from the church readings because it was determined to be a forgery. Apostolic Origins was a vital part, while not the sole part, it was a vital part of canonical attributes. And as was mentioned when we were first opening up this dialogue on canonical models and methodologies, we mentioned that there would be possible defeaters. So what about the defeater that most of the New Testament, by a majority of scholars today, is regarded as pseudonymous? And what I mean by pseudonymous is that it was written by an author who is not the apostle, but claiming to be the apostle. This would be a claim made against several of the Pauline letters, particularly the pastoral epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. This claim is leveled against 2nd Peter. It's leveled against a lot of the Catholic epistles, the letters of John. And the argument is that these aren't written by Paul or Peter or John, but they're written by a person or persons that are claiming to be Paul, Peter, or John, and that this was not an uncommon practice. And of course, men like Richard Bauckham and others would argue that there's nothing to be worried about. This is not something to even cause us to question canonicity, because pseudonymous writings were accepted at that time in the greater Greco-Roman world. And while that may be true to some extent or another, there is no reason for us to think that was accepted in the Christian community. And we've already touched on why. Partly because we see the example of the earliest church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries rejecting books on the basis of them not being written by the author who it claims to be written by. But also it comes back to our canonical methodology. Just as I had said at the very beginning, how you perceive the canon determines how you perceive the creation of the canon and the purpose of the canon. In an article written recently that is on the website, the why of the canon will determine the what of the canon. And so if the canon is nothing more than a group of books that have special authority placed on them externally by an organization, then there is no reason to think that it would matter who authored them. There is no reason to think that pseudonymy would matter. However, as we have looked at, as we have seen and discussed, if the New Testament is in fact the new covenant that follows after the Old Covenant, it is the plan of God's redemption that follows with revelation, that the apostles had a self-awareness of apostolic agents, of being covenantal agents to communicate this plan of redemption to all the world, you have even less reason to believe that the authors would not be who they claim to be, or that the community to which these letters and these books were written would accept them, knowing that they were not. And of course, it has to be stated as well that there are a large number of scholars, critical scholars, who reject the idea of pseudonymous writings. Most of the accusations against these letters are on the basis of style, grammar, literary writing, and sometimes content. But of course, most of these arguments, when they're really examined, are very unpersuasive. There are dozens of reasons that can explain the differences in content of these letters, not the least of which is the use of different grammatical scribes. What they would call amanuenses was a common practice. We know that Paul used one since he had difficulty with his vision. It would not be uncommon to think that Peter used one, since he is earlier spoken of as an unlearned man. The use of a scribe, and different scribes, if they use different scribes, would provide an explanation for different grammatical styles, especially if that scribe was given a certain amount of leniency, as was common in the day, with how they would communicate the message. Beyond that, you have to acknowledge that the different contexts of the letters, the different reasons for which they are written, will change how they are written and who they are written to. If it is written to a person versus written to a community, it will have a different tone and a different grammatical style, just as if you wrote a formal letterhead to a business would not be written in the same manner that you would write your brother or a friend across the ocean. So in the end, these arguments against apostolic authorship, they have trouble holding weight on their own, but they stem from a canonical methodology that does not acknowledge any intrinsic value within the New Testament canon itself. But as we've tried to demonstrate in this short video, if that value does come from the text, it is a covenant document communicated by the apostles. The canonicity is not something that the church applied to the books, but that the books forced their canonicity onto the church through the weight of apostolic authorship.